The night shift always began the same way, with the quiet room full of screens and low lights settling into its slow rhythm, while the city outside turned into a map of small, distant problems. The dispatch operator had learned to read the patterns without thinking, the way calls rose and fell with the hours, the way certain neighborhoods went silent, while others never seemed to sleep. That evening felt ordinary in every visible way, and that was what made the first details stand out. An incident number appeared in the queue that did not follow the sequence, not by much, just enough to feel like a typo, yet the system did not correct it. She checked the previous entries, refreshed the screen, and watched the number remain where it was, clean and stable, waiting to be assigned. The call attached to it was not urgent, just a request for a welfare check at a small commercial building that had been empty for years, a place that still showed up in the system because removing addresses took longer than anyone admitted. She routed it to a veteran officer who preferred the quiet calls, the kind that ended with locked doors and dark windows, and a short note in the report. As he drove, the radio carried the usual traffic, but something in the timing felt slightly off, like a pause that lasted a second longer than it should have. He reached the street and saw that the building was still there, still dark, still wrapped in the same faded signage, yet the description he had been given matched it too well down to the side door that rarely showed up in records. He walked the perimeter and found nothing open, nothing broken, nothing that asked for more than a quick look and a patient note. Back at the desk, the dispatcher listened as he cleared the call, and she closed the incident, only to notice that the timestamp did not match her memory of when she had sent him. It was close, but not exact, and when she checked the log, the call seemed to have begun before she had touched her keyboard. She told herself that systems drift and clocks disagree, and that long hours make small things feel important. The rest of the shift continued in the same quiet way, yet each routine action left a faint impression that something had been slightly rearranged. Another call arrived that described a street the officer had just left, and then another that repeated a detail from an earlier report without being linked to it. The officer, moving through empty spaces and parked shadows, began to notice that the scenes felt prepared, as if someone had walked through them and decided what should remain. Nothing was missing, and nothing was added, but the order of small objects felt deliberate. By the time the first pale hint of morning touched the edges of the city, both of them were tired in a way that did not come from work alone, and the shift ended without any event that could be named, only a quiet sense that the night had been taking notes of its own. The second night began with the same routine, but the building no longer felt the same to either of them, even though nothing visible had changed, and no one could have said exactly why. The dispatcher arrived early and opened the log from the previous shift, reading through it with more care than she normally would, noticing how clean and ordinary it looked on the surface, and how little it reflected the uneasy sense she had carried home. The incident numbers were in order again, the timestamps neat and aligned, and the strange call from the night before sat among them without drawing attention to itself. Still, she found herself reading it twice, then a third time, trying to remember what she had felt while sending the officer there, and failing to recall anything specific beyond the mild surprise. The veteran officer started his patrol the same way he always did, driving familiar routes and letting the city reveal its small, quiet problems one at a time, and for the first few hours, nothing happened that would have been worth a second thought. He checked a closed storefront, passed a park where the lights were still on, and stopped once to help a stalled car, and each report went through the system without delay or comment. Yet between calls, he kept thinking about the empty building from the night before, and how the space had felt less abandoned than it should have, as if the air inside had been recently disturbed and then carefully put back. He told himself that old places often felt that way, and that experience had taught him to see patterns where none existed. In the dispatch room, the screens continued to fill and clear, and the operator worked through them with steady focus. But she began to notice that some entries carried small details she did not remember typing. A street name would appear spelled a different way, or a note would include a description she was certain had not been said aloud. And when she checked the audio, everything sounded normal and complete. The system showed no errors and no outside access, and the technicians had already assured her that nothing had been changed or restored. Still, the more she compared what she remembered to what was written, the more the gap between them seemed to grow. Later in the shift, the officer was sent to a quiet residential block for a noise complaint that turned out to be nothing more than a loose gate. And as he stood there closing it, he noticed a porch light across the street flick on and then off again in a way that felt deliberate rather than automatic. When he checked the address, it matched a call he could not remember receiving. And when he asked for confirmation, the reply came back calm and routine, as if the question itself had been unnecessary. He finished the call and drove on, but the sense of being slightly out of step with the night stayed with him. By morning, both of them were left with the same careful uncertainty, the kind that comes from knowing that nothing has gone wrong and still feeling that something has shifted. The records were clean, the calls resolved, and the city unchanged, yet the quiet space between what was heard and what was written seemed wider than before. Neither of them spoke about it, and there was no reason to. But as the sun rose and the shift ended, the system kept its own silence, and whatever had begun to form during those hours remained unnamed and perfectly unremarked. The third night brought a change that was small enough to hide inside routine, yet clear enough to refuse to be ignored. The dispatcher noticed it first, when a call appeared already tagged as pending review, even though she had not opened it, and when she checked the clock, she saw that the system believed the call had been waiting longer than she had been at her desk. She listened to the audio and heard a calm, ordinary voice describing a dark parking structure and a single light that kept turning itself off, and nothing in the words stood out, but the tone felt practiced. She sent the veteran officer, and as she did, she felt the same mild resistance in the keyboard she had felt earlier, a soft delay that vanished when she tried to focus on it. On the drive, the officer heard the address and realized he had been there 2 weeks earlier for an unrelated call. Yet the description he was given included a stairwell he was sure did not exist. He arrived and found the structure as empty as before, but the stairwell was there, narrow and clean, with a new coat of paint that had not yet lost its smell. He walked it from top to bottom and found nothing wrong. Yet when he stepped back outside, he saw a chalk marking near the entrance that looked like a temporary note, already blurred by passing shoes, and he could not remember seeing it when he went in. Back in the dispatch room, the operator watched the status change to cleared before she heard his voice on the radio, and she wondered if she had imagined the order of events, but the log showed it plainly. She began to compare the active queue with the archive, and saw that certain calls shared phrases and pacing, as if written by the same hand, even when the callers were different and the locations far apart. The pattern was not dramatic, just a preference for certain words, and once she saw it, she could not stop seeing it. The officer, meanwhile, continued from one quiet place to another, and at each stop he found some small sign of preparation. A door left unlocked and then closed, a light switched on and then off, a chair turned to face a window that held nothing. None of it was enough to write down, yet together it formed a trail he could feel but not prove. Near the end of the shift, he was sent back toward the parking structure, only to be told that the call had been reassigned, and when he checked the map, the address had shifted by 1 block without any note. When the morning came, the dispatcher saved her work and hesitated before logging out, and the officer sat in his car longer than usual, quietly, both of them aware that the city had not changed, and that was the part that no longer felt true. By the 4th night, the pattern no longer felt like something that could be blamed on fatigue or coincidence, even though nothing in the system would admit to it. The dispatcher arrived with a notebook she did not remember deciding to bring, and before logging in, She wrote down the time from the wall clock, then the time from her screen, then the time from her phone, and noted how close they were without being the same. She told herself it was normal and still kept writing. The first few calls passed through without trouble, yet she noticed that the queue seemed to breathe, growing and shrinking in a way that did not match the flow of the city. And once she saw an incident number fade and return with a different final digit. When she opened an archived file to compare, she found a version of a call she was certain had never ended that way, not in any way that matched her memory, and the audio confirmed the text, as if her recollection had been quietly edited. Across town, the veteran officer followed his assignments through streets that felt carefully emptied, and he began to notice that the quiet was not uniform, that some blocks carried the normal distant sound of traffic, while others seemed wrapped in a thicker, more deliberate stillness. He responded to a report of a light in a warehouse district and found the building locked, the windows dark, and the light still on inside. And when he circled it, he saw that someone had recently swept a narrow path through dust near a side door, and then carefully scattered the dust again, leaving only the faintest difference in texture. When he reported in, the acknowledgement came before he finished, and the dispatcher saw the status change before she touched anything. And for a moment, both of them paused in their work without knowing why. She began to keep the notebook open beside her keyboard, writing down what she sent and what she heard back. And she noticed that the system always seemed to be one step ahead of her notes, not by much, just enough to feel like anticipation rather than response. The officer drove to another call that described a place he could see from the end of the street, and when he arrived, he found a chair set in the middle of an empty room facing a wall that showed a faint rectangle where something had once hung. The air felt recently disturbed, like a room after a short meeting, and he stood there longer than he should have, listening to nothing and feeling that the quiet had weight. As the hours passed, the dispatcher saw the same phrasing return in different reports, and the officer found the same small signs of order repeated in places that should have been neglected, and neither of them could find a single moment where something clearly broke the rules. Near the end of the shift, a call appeared and disappeared without being answered, and the log showed it as resolved with his name attached, even though he had not been there. When morning came, the records were clean again, a notebook full of small, careful observations, and the city unchanged. But both of them knew that the space between what was happening and what was being written had grown wider, and that something in the system now seemed to be working with a patience that did not belong to any person. By the fifth night, avoidance was no longer possible, not because anything dramatic had happened, but because the quiet adjustments had become too precise to ignore. The dispatcher sat down and did not log in right away, watching the screens as they filled themselves with the slow confidence of a system that did not need her permission. And she noticed that one incident was already assigned to the veteran officer, even though he had not yet signed on. She wrote the time in her notebook, then wrote it again when the assignment changed by 1 minute without any visible action. And only then did she log in and accept the shift. The city moved as it always did, but the queue no longer felt like a mirror of it, more like a schedule that the city was following with a slight delay. The first few calls went to other units, and she watched them clear before the voices came back over the radio, as if the order of cause and record had been quietly reversed. When the officer finally checked in, he was already driving, already aware that the night had a destination for him, even though he did not know what it was. His first assignment took him past the empty parking structure in the warehouse district, and then beyond, toward a part of the city where addresses were sparse and the streetlights stood farther apart, and the route he was given was not the shortest, but it felt deliberate. He arrived at a low, forgotten office building that still carried a faded directory by the door, and he noticed that the front desk inside was clean in a way that did not match the rest of the place, as if someone had made a single effort and then stopped. The call was for a light that would not stay off, and he found it on in a back room, and when he turned it off, it stayed off, and when he turned it on, it stayed on, and there was nothing to fix. Yet as he stood there, he saw a thin line in the dust on the floor that suggested something had been dragged to a precise spot, and then removed, and he felt the same sense of a completed task that had followed him for days. When he reported in, the dispatcher heard his voice and saw the call clear itself before she touched anything, and she realized that the notebook entries she was making were now always behind the screen, never ahead of it. She tried to open an archive file to compare, and found that it had been accessed moments earlier under her name. Then a new call appeared, already marked as priority, already assigned, already acknowledged, and it sent him to an address that did not appear on his map until he was almost there. The building was a narrow structure between two lots, and it looked as if it had always been there and never been noticed. Inside, the rooms were empty, but the chairs were arranged as if a meeting had just ended, and the air carried the faint sense of movement that had nowhere to go. He stood in the center of it and waited for something that did not arrive. Back at the desk, the dispatcher watched the log complete itself, line by line, and for the first time she understood that the shift was no longer something they were working through, but something that was working through them, and that whatever was being arranged would be finished whether they chose to be there or not. The sixth night did not announce itself as different, and that was the most unsettling part, because both of them arrived already carrying the expectation that something had been decided without them. The dispatcher logged in and found the queue almost empty, not quiet in the normal way, but arranged as if the absence of calls was itself a schedule, and she noticed that the system clock had settled on a time that matched her notebook for once, and stayed there. She turned a page and did not write anything, because every line she considered writing was already present on the screen in some form. The veteran officer checked in and waited, and for several minutes there was nothing, and then a single assignment appeared, already tagged as routine, already acknowledged, already stamped with a time that was a few minutes in the future. The address was not unfamiliar, yet it did not belong to any category he could name, and when he began driving, he realized that the route did not require directions, that his turns were being made before he thought about them. The city looked the same, but the spaces between buildings felt carefully measured, and the streetlights seemed to hold their light a fraction longer than usual, as if waiting for something to pass. He arrived at a narrow stretch of road where a small structure sat back from the curb, and he could not remember when it had been built, only that it fit as if it had always been there. Inside, the rooms were empty and clean in the same selective way he had seen before, and in the center of the largest room there was a desk with nothing on it, facing a wall that showed the faint outline of a frame that was no longer there. He stood and listened and heard nothing, and yet the air felt recently arranged. When he reported in, the dispatcher saw the call close itself, and then a second line appeared beneath it, marked complete, with no audio attached and no location listed, only his unit number and a time that matched the present exactly. She tried to open it and found that it could not be selected, and when she refreshed the screen, it remained quiet and final, like a note that did not want to be read. The officer walked back outside and noticed that the street had no traffic in either direction, and he waited for a sound that did not come, and then his radio produced a short, clean acknowledgement that did not belong to any voice he recognized, and the channel returned to silence. Back at the desk, the dispatcher watched the queue remain empty, and then watched a single new incident number appear and stay unassigned, and she knew without knowing how that it was not for anyone. She wrote the time in her notebook and saw it match the screen and did not turn the page. When the shift ended, the logs were complete, the city was unchanged, and there was nothing that could be pointed to as wrong, yet the final entry remained, and neither of them could say whether it had recorded something that had already happened or something that no longer needed to.